Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video, I'm going to be talking about 7 chords, that is, leading tone and subtonic chords. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then this is the video for you. But before you watch this video, you should check out my video on spelling and resolving dominant 7th chords. You'll need some of that information to understand what I'm talking about here. 7 chords, some of my favorite chords in the entire major-minor tonal system. They have a very interesting sound, and they can be used in a variety of ways that can, quite frankly, make the music a whole lot more interesting. 7 chords are used in 2 ways in the major-minor tonal system. The first is as a substitution for the dominant. We can think of these as being dominant 7th chords or dominant 9th chords in which the root of the chord, scale degree 5, has been removed. So they would consist of, if it's a triad, scale degree 7, 2, and 4, and if it's a 7th chord, scale degree 7, 2, 4, and 6, and if we're dealing with the minor mode, that 6 will be the lowered 6th scale degree. The other way that leading tone and subtonic chords are used are as part of the circle of fifths progression. We can tell the difference in the minor mode because the leading tone chord will be built on the raised 7th scale degree, and the subtonic chord will be built on the lowered 7th scale degree. Leading tone chords are dominant function and they resolve to tonic. Subtonic chords are neither dominant nor tonic function. They kind of act as dominant function, but they resolve to the median triad, the 3 chord instead. Like I said, in the minor mode we can tell the difference based on whether the root of the chord is the raised or lowered 7th scale degree. In the major mode, however, these 2 chords look and sound identical, and so we have to figure out which one's being used based on context. Let's start by talking about how to resolve a diminished triad that's acting as a dominant substitute. Remember that a dominant 7th chord consists of scale degrees 5, 7, 2, and 4, and wants to resolve to a tonic function chord. If we were to remove the root of that chord, we would be left with scale degrees 7, 2, and 4, which still has the same sound as a dominant, but it's just missing 1 scale degree. That is how we get a dominant substitution leading tone triad. Typically when we part write these things, we're going to double the third of the chord, and this goes back to the very old part writing rules about not doubling tendency tones, and the interval between the root and the 5th of the chord creates 2 tendency tones. That is, it's a tritone, and so therefore we're not going to double either one of those because both those tones have to resolve a specific way. So once you get the thing voiced, and here I have one that's voiced, what you need to do first is find the tendency tones and resolve them. I always start with the root of the chord, which is scale degree 7, or the leading tone. And that leading tone will want to resolve up by step to scale degree 1. Next, I take a look at the chord 5th, which is scale degree 4. Now I'm thinking of this thing as being the 7th of the dominant 7th chord that's just missing a root. And as we know, all good chord 7ths must resolve down by step. So the 5th of a diminished triad, a 7 chord, needs to resolve down by step. The 3rd of the chord, we have a little bit of liberty with what we can do with it. Since it's our doubled tone, we're going to want to make sure that one instance of the 3rd of the chord resolves up and the other resolves down. Now, if you're dealing with 3 voices, you really have a choice of which direction you take it, either up or down. So in this case, I'm going to find my 2/3. I'm going to make one of them resolve up to scale degree 3, and the other will resolve down to scale degree 2. And the resolution of this chord sounds like this. Now if I change it to a leading tone 7th chord, then 3 of the tones in the chord are going to be tendency tones that must resolve a particular way. And it doesn't really matter whether I'm dealing with major or minor, the resolutions are going to be very similar. So I take a look at the tones in my leading tone 7th chord. It's going to consist of scale degree 7, 2, 4, and 6. And if I'm dealing in the minor mode, as you see in your example here, I have scale degree raised 7, 2, 4, and lowered 6. 3 of these tones are tendency tones. They're very easy to find, and that makes this chord very easy to resolve. So first, I find the root of the chord, which is the leading tone, which should resolve up by step to scale degree 1. Next, I find the 5th of the chord, which is the 7th of that dominant 7th that's missing its root, and again, all good chord 7ths must resolve down by step. So the 5th of the chord, or scale degree 4, should resolve down by step to scale degree 3. Now I find the 7th of the chord, which is also a chord 7th, so this chord really has 2 chord 7ths in it. And again, all good chord 7ths must resolve down by step, so the 7th of the chord will also resolve down by step from scale degree 6 down to scale degree 5. The 3rd of the chord, scale degree 2, is the one tone that has a little bit of flexibility with what you do to it, but only in certain situations. And this is where we need to check things before we figure out what to do with it. If the 3rd of the chord appears below the 7th of the chord in the voicing, as you see here, then it must resolve up by step. If you were to take it down by step, you'll notice that the 3rd to the 7th creates an interval of a 5th, and as both those tones resolve, because remember the 7th has to resolve down by step, it would go down to scale degree 1 and scale degree 5, also a 5th, parallel 5ths, and we want to avoid that. So if the 3rd of the chord is voiced below the 7th of the chord, it must resolve up by step to scale degree 3. Keep in mind, if you do that, you're going to end up with a resolution chord with a little bit of a non-standard voicing. So when you leave that resolution chord, you're going to have to figure out what to do with it. If, however, the 3rd of the chord is voiced above the 7th of the chord, as you see here, that means we have an interval of a 4th between the 7th and the 3rd of the chord. We can write parallel perfect 4ths as much as we want, although we don't want to overdo it. So in this case, we can have that scale degree 2, the 3rd of the chord, resolve down by step. If that seems like a lot to memorize, then you can simply remember that the 5th and the 7th will always be safe if you resolve those down by step, and the root of the 3rd will always be safe if you resolve them up by step. So the 2 pairs of members of the chords will converge upon each other. That's a safe way, though not always the most musical way to think about it. Now the other way these chords are sometimes used is as part of the circle of fifths progression. In the minor mode, since the 7 chord in this context is not going to be a dominant function chord, it doesn't resolve to a tonic function chord, we would typically double the root of the chord, have 1/3 and 1/5, and then we would simply run it through the circle of fifths progression as we would normally part write it. And that sounds like this. In the major mode, we do not have 2 different versions of scale degree 7. So the subtonic chord is going to sound exactly the same as the leading tone chord. That is, they're going to be spelled with the same notes. We can tell the difference by how the chord resolves and how it's voiced. So if we're using it in a circle of fifths progression, like this, we'll typically see the root of the chord being doubled, something you would typically not do with a diminished triad, and the resolution will go to a mediant triad or mediant 7th chord, the 3 chord. And so that sounds like this. One of the things that makes the leading tone and subtonic chords so interesting, especially if there's a 7th on it, is the scale degree content. It contains scale degrees 7 and 2, which are very much dominant sounding scale degrees. They exist in all the dominant function chords, but they also contain scale degree 4 and 6, or lowered 6, in the minor mode. and those are very much subdominant sounding or predominant sounding scale degrees. So in a sense, this chord kind of bridges the gap. It combines elements of dominant and elements of predominant in one sound. And if you voice it a particular way, like this, what you're going to find is a chord that sounds both predominant and dominant at the same time. So if you remember from my video on harmonic progression, dominant function chords and predominant function chords act as a sort of opposition to each other, equidistant from the tonic chord, and then resolve into the tonic chord. Usually goes predominant to dominant to tonic, but using this trick, we can have one chord do the job of both the predominant and the dominant simultaneously before resolving to the tonic. Another fun thing about these subtonic chords is oftentimes they'll be used in major as a sort of dominant substitute. That is, we have to use a little bit of chromaticism to make this work. If we build a chord on the lowered 7th scale degree, that will oftentimes have the sound of a dominant function chord, and it sounds like this. Now what's really going on here is quite fascinating. It's typically used in this context in music that is more of a folk or rock and roll type of sound. What's going on in that musical language is that a plagal sound, or a 4-to-1 type of sound on the cadence, is as common, in some cases more common, than an authentic or dominant to tonic sound. So what we can do then is we can think of that 7 chord built on the lowered 7th scale degree as being a sort of subdominant to the subdominant. That is, if we start out with our tonic chord, we find the 4 chord from there, and then we found another 4 chord from that 4 chord, we would end up with that subtonic chord in the major mode. So in a sense, it's almost a doubly plagal cadence that happens when we have the flat 7 going to the tonic. It's a lovely sound, and one that, quite frankly, could be used more in music. So let's summarize. Leading tone and subtonic triads, 7 chords, typically take dominant function. In the major mode, they consist of scale degrees 7, 2, and 4, and if it's a 7-7 chord, we'll add scale degree 6 on top of that. In the minor mode, they consist of the raised 7th scale degree if it's a leading tone chord, scale degree 2, scale degree 4, and scale degree lowered 6. If it's acting as a subtonic chord, then we're going to have the lowered 7th scale degree 2, scale degree 4, and the lowered 6th scale degree. There are 2 uses of these chords. One is as a dominant function chord, in which it acts as a dominant 7th chord or dominant 9th chord that's missing its root and needs to be resolved appropriately as we would resolve the tones of that dominant 7th or dominant 9th chord. The other way it can be used is as a true subtonic chord as part of a circle of fifths progression in which it progresses to the median chord or the 3 chord. In the minor mode, we can tell the difference easily because the 7th scale degree will be raised when it's dominant function and lowered when it's acting as part of the circle of fifths. In the major mode, since we don't have 2 different 7th scale degrees, the 2 chords are identical in sound. They'll be different, however, in how they resolve. Well, that does it for this video. If you found it helpful, please like. As always, please feel free to leave constructive comments below. And to find out about all the latest music theory bites as they become available, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Until next time.